thank you everyone for coming, and welcome to the 12th Welfare and Safety of the Racehorse Summit. We started this event in 2006, so we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the first Welfare and Safety Summit. First, we'd like to thank the Jockey Club and our host, Keeneland, who's been a partner in all of these except for the last one when the pavilion was getting renovated and we were at UK. A lot of great ideas have come from this summit, and a lot of best practices have been shared. I think in the last 20 years, this culture of safety and welfare for our animal has really shown in our efforts, and you'll see a lot of what those efforts are today through not only the Equine Injury Database, but also through the creation of HISA, the coordination of National Vets List, the effect of the void claim rule, what is going on in necropsy and mortality review panels, a few aftercare focused programs. But through and through, our industry has created a culture of safety, which is now permeating to our athletes, equine and human, competing on a safer basis throughout our races. So nothing further from me except for to introduce our MCs for the next day and a half. Parks racecourse announcer, and a friend of Grayson and the horse, Jessica Paquette.
Hi everyone, good morning. First, I want to extend my sincere appreciation to the Grayson Jockey Club Research Foundation for including me in this event. It is a great honor to participate in something that makes such a difference for bettering the sport that we love for the animals that we love. One commonality shared by everyone in this room is a love for the horse. We're all here because we want to see the goalposts continually move forward as we strive to make the sport better and safer for all involved. Now, 2026, the year of the horse. And my year of the horse has involved a severe, potentially career-ending soft tissue injury, a rare corneal fungal infection, colic, and EPM, because horses, right? But I can stand here and tell you that all three of my horses are still here and thriving, largely thanks to the advances made in veterinary medicine and research funded by our friends at Grayson. The work they do is critical to improving the health, longevity, and happiness of horses of all breeds, disciplines, and in every life stage. So I won't take up any more of your time, but I'm looking forward to 2 days of wonderful panels, and we'll start the day. I'll introduce our first panel. It is the Equine Injury Database update presented by Dr. Tim Parkin, the head of Bristol Veterinary School.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you again for the invite to come back and present and keep you updated as to where we are with respect to the Equine Injury Database. Forgive me, too much travel across the Atlantic, frequently end up with one of those colds you get on planes all the time, so forgive me, I'm just going to, if I drink a bit of water halfway through this. So, as Jamie said, 20 years since the first of these summits, and when talking to Jamie about what you wanted to hear this time around, we thought it was worth just a bit of reflection, thinking about progress made, where we've come from, think back to 2008, and the headlines that were around at the stage. I'll then talk a little bit about a couple of the more impactful risk factors that we've identified and then that have led to regulatory change that are really important, that demonstrate the true value of the Equine Injury Database. Then I'm going to take a leap over to Hong Kong and talk about some of the other work that we do over there and how that has translated into data-driven risk profiles being provided to the vets on a routine basis now prior to their pre-race veterinary inspections, and really then finally talk about how we might bring it back to this part of the world and actually how we might be able to utilize what we've learned in Hong Kong to see if we can implement something in a similar fashion over here, which I think hopefully might be the next big gain for us over here. So if we look back and think about what was going on in 2008, some pretty horrendous headlines in the papers, people up in front of Congress. We all know the history. And the conclusion was that at that time, one of the major issues was that there was no reliable, comprehensive data on injuries sustained during racing across the nation. It had actually been back in October 2006, the first summit that the EID was first proposed, and really it was then clearly galvanized by events that followed over the next couple of years. Sorry. And in the 2008 summit, a plan was presented to establish the Equine Injury Database. And again, whenever I talk about this, and you have to pay due respect to Mary Scollay, sat at the back here, who really drove this enormously, firstly starting to collect injury data by paper, collating them all, demonstrating that there was a genuine want and sort of urgency from the tracks to volunteer to do this, to report their injury data. And really that was really, really important to show that it was worth the investment to set up an online or a digital equine injury database that we are now have been able to use for a number of years to really drive welfare change. And I think looking back on this, I wrote a paper a year ago or 18 months ago about the impact of the EID, and I look back at the original goals presented at the time, and they still stand, and they really, if I were to write them now, then I wouldn't change them at all. They are exactly as they are, and I can say those three original goals to identify frequency, type, and outcome of racing injuries, develop centralized epi database that can be used to identify markers for horses at increased risk, and to provide a data source for research directed at the ongoing improvement in safety and welfare and preventing injuries. Those are exactly what we still currently use the EID for, and they very neatly summarize all the different branches of the work, primarily that we do and my team do with the Equine Injury Database. So I think really, really important initiative, and I think I gave a paper in Hong Kong at a conference there, and I think I probably, whether I was overstating or not, but the title of the paper was, "This is the single most important initiative that came out of North American racing in the last 20 years." If we look at 18 years later, since we really started collecting these data in earnest, we now have more than 5.5 million starts available to us from more than 350,000 horses, 9 million training events, all the signal data that goes with those, so age, sex, et cetera, massive amount of race performance data, growing amount of fast work training data. From those original data that are recorded in the EID and then the associated databases, we, by routine, and my team, Ewan Bennett at the University of Glasgow runs the annual audit, and this is where the latest year of data are added in to the big data set. As soon as that happens, code is run to create at least 300 new variables from these original data that then we plug through multivariable models to identify the latest models that identify risk factors, etc. That modeling process takes quite a long time, so we do it once every few years. In reality, there are several billion data points in those data sets. So this is no longer the type of data that you can wrangle on a spreadsheet. And we have talked previously about the use of artificial intelligence to analyze these data, and I've had PhD students look at the efficacy of artificial intelligence versus routine statistical methods. And although AI does provide some sort of efficiency with respect to model running, actually the outputs you get are relatively similar, and actually there's no real predictive benefit provided by artificial intelligence. The predictive limit is the type of data we have available to us, and that'll bring me back to what I'll talk about, some of the work we do in Hong Kong, and excitingly, what we are about to start doing over here as well, later on in the talk. But really what the fundamental objective of all of this work in the idea is to identify risk factors, then provide evidence for likely effective interventions in the industry, all aimed at reducing injury prevalence and improving welfare. So what's the current status? And any of you aware that in March, every year, the annual data are presented by the Jockey Club. We run the audit, as I said. And, you know, it is an enormous success story. You know, 47% reduction in risk since 2009 in 2025. If the same, now over the same period of time, then we know there's been a reduction in starts, but if we were to normalize that and say, okay, if there had been the same number of starts in 2025 compared to 2009, that equates to 220 fewer horses dying on North American racetracks this year than would have done in 2009. So I think that's an enormous number and really, really important to recognize. I talk about this a lot, and I've probably used this slide before, just updated every year, but I think there has been a significant attitudinal change in this country many years ago now. Welfare is clearly much higher up the agenda. But there are also important, it's not just about thinking about what we do, decision making. It's also about how this analysis feeds into regulatory change. And as I said, I'll talk about a couple of different areas where I think the analysis that has come from the EID has clearly informed that regulatory change and provided confidence that there's not just an association between a regulation or an intervention and the likelihood of fatal injury, but actually there's a true causal impact and effect of that regulatory change and potential intervention. If we look at the change in risk by surface type over the same period of time. Now, clearly, the main driver of that overall risk is dirt, predominant surface in this country, and that follows a very similar pattern to the overall level of risk, going down, as you might expect, by 46.2%, so very close to the 47%. What we've seen, there's been a further, a greater reduction in risk on turf, more than 55%, and a slightly lesser reduction in synthetic, 35% over that period of time. They're all clearly going in the right direction. I think something of interest, though, if you can tease it out, the orange line is dirt, the blue line is synthetic, and the green is turf. Recognise the colours might be a bit difficult to see. But what has happened over just the last 2 years is that synthetic has drifted up, and now actually there's very little difference in the risk of fatal injury on turf compared to synthetic. And actually, if you look at it overall, all surfaces are somewhat converging. And I'm not quite sure why this might be, whether there have been changes to the way that we manage turf, or whether there are changes to the way that we manage, or you manage dirt, synthetic, or whether it's the point where actually those synthetic tracks are very effective early on in their life, and actually their maintenance is something that needs to be paid greater attention to, and actually over a period of time maybe they do drift up, as we've seen in the last couple of years. But it's something we really want to keep an eye on. I think it shows that actually the impact of the surface on the overall risk is probably becoming less, and actually what is more important is to recognize and remember that actually there are a multitude of different factors that contribute to risk for an individual horse racing on an individual day in a particular race. Many of them related to its training, its genetics, etc., etc. And it's not just to do with the surface. But nevertheless, it's really important that we keep an eye on this and ensure that we understand why there are changes in risk on different surface types over a period of time. And then the other way we broke this down this year, primarily driven by some of the concerns that we've seen last year in 2025 related to 2-year-olds, breaking it down by the change in risk, and this only goes back to 2016, the change in risk by age. And we break the horses down by either 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, or 4+ horses, 4+ years horses. And you'll see that generally, and the predominant factor here, and probably what comes into the models, is that 2-year-olds are generally safer or less likely to end up with a fatal injury than 3-year-olds or 4+ year-olds. And you can see that if you look at this across the picture, then you've got the green and the blue are two lines that kind of wiggle between each other. They overlap sometimes. And the orange generally stays below the level of the green and the blue being the 3-year-old and the 4+ year-olds, and the orange being the 2-year-old. However, there have been a couple of years where the 2-year-olds actually spike and end up being the population that are most likely to end up with a fatal injury. And we're not quite sure why that is. So the first of those was in 2020, and we wrote a paper down at the bottom there, the anomalous incidents. Now, obviously, 2020 will be remembered for many other things than the 2-year-old spike in fatal injury rates. And we looked at this, and because of some of the COVID impacts on racing, then the only discernible change or statistically significant change we saw in that population, indeed in 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, was a slightly moderately delayed start to training in that year, given that COVID started in March, April time, and actually there were some impacts that had on ability to train. And this was driven by our analysis of the fast work data that was available to us. So there was a hint that that change or that delay in start to training may have been associated with an increased likelihood of fatal injury in the 2-year-olds at that period. Now, there was a delay in starting training for that year for 3 and 4-year-olds, but it didn't seem to have the same impact. Now, what has happened in 2025, we're unsure. We've rerun the same analysis that we did in 2020, and the same thing didn't come up. There was no particular delay in the start to training. So there are some other things going on, but at the moment we genuinely are unable to identify what that might have been. One thing to point out, though, is that actually we're talking about a relatively small absolute number in the change in the total number of fatal injuries from 2024 to 25 in that particular population, just increasing by 8. Now, it's a large percentage increase because we have a relatively small number of horses of 2-year-olds being fatally injured in that population. And that makes it quite difficult for us to identify what those changes may be, simply due to statistical power. So we may not identify what the driver of that spike last year was. We will wait to see what happens in 2026. That doesn't mean we're not looking and trying to understand why that might be the case. But at the moment, I don't have an answer for you. And I think the answer that we produced in 2020 does come with a lot of caveats. It was as I said, it was the only thing we could identify as being a particular change in that population's training or racing program for the year that may or may not be associated with a likelihood of fatal injury. So just to talk a little bit about a couple of the risk factors we've identified through the use of the Equine Injury Database that I think have led to significant change. First one, it will be void claim rule, and then talk a little bit about the vets list. I know this has been of interest recently. I did a TV piece just a few months ago, back from home, talking about the vets list and the justification for the vet list decisions and that sort of thing. But first of all, if we look at void claim rules, we did some initial work on this back in 2019, and I think, if I recall rightly, we presented this at the online safety summit in 2020, I think it was. And it really was just a very simple investigation of those tracks that had introduced, since 2009, a void claim rule onto their track. So any tracks that already had a void claim rule back in 2009 were excluded. Any tracks that still didn't have a void claim rule back in 2019, I think is when we ran these analyses, were excluded as well. So it only included that subset of tracks where there had been a change in management, change of policy with respect to void claim rules. And there was some quite clear evidence that if you look at the data before the introduction of the void claim rule at that track, then the likelihood of fatal injury was above 2, somewhere like 2.2 per 1,000. Post the introduction of that void claim rule, then the likelihood of fatal injury was down closer to 1.6 per 1,000 horses starts on that track in claiming races. We saw a similar but a less marked difference between maiden claiming races, but again, not quite statistically significant in that case, but again, going in the same direction. And I think this initial work clearly suggested a protective effect of void claim rules. Further void claim rules were developed and introduced at multiple tracks, as you all know. And I think the value of just doing some relatively simple analyses, that isn't particularly complex, doesn't take a lot of time to do, but would only really be available with the granularity of the data we have in the Equine Injury Database is really important. That initial analysis, I believe, provided further confidence that further development of void claim rules with greater scope, greater definition, increased scope to include other horses ending up with different things post-race would likely be beneficial. So I think it gave the regulator the confidence, or regulators or those on individual tracks, the confidence to go further with their void claim rule. And then this is a paper that came out last year, I think it was, our latest big multivariable model, which takes account of everything that we have in the Equine Injury Database and really is the best source on a routine basis that we can have to identify those things, those interventions that are most likely to be efficacious going forward, where attention should be paid. And this was a statistically significant association with respect to void claim rules, categorized into every start was on a track that fell into 6 different categories. Either there was no void claim rule, or there were 5 different types of void claim rule in place at that track at that time of that start. Type 1 being the most, with the smallest definition, so only void claim with respect to a fatally injured horse, where type 5, which is we call the HISA type, which includes fatality, being on the vet list, having bled, or being banned off. And what you can see is that compared to tracks at which there was no void claim rule or just the one type 1 or type 2 void claim rule, the other types of void claim rule provided or were associated with a reduction in the likelihood of fatal injury at those tracks. Whereas with at the extreme, those on the type 5 void claim rule, including everything, 32% less likely to end up with a fatal injury at the end of that start compared to horses racing at tracks where there is either no void claim rule or just the type 1 or type 2 void claim rule. So having gone all the way back from 2019, running those analyses rather simplistically, looked at the intervention, having had the intervention put in place and what being made more widespread, and further void claim rule develops. This is kind of now the sort of the assessment of the efficacy of that individual regulatory change, and I think it proves the point that actually it's clearly still an efficacious intervention and an efficacious regulatory change that has clearly been of benefit to the racing industry. The other aspect I just want to talk about relates to days since worked off the vets list. And this is an interesting plot. Originally, I think when we did these analyses back in 2016, there was a slightly different picture that we saw, and it does show that actually we need to be aware that the racing industry changes. Lots of things change over time, not necessarily just related to management of the tracks or the race horse themselves, but the genetics and training regimes, et cetera, et cetera. So we always need to be rerunning these models to make sure that what we identified originally is still pertinent. But fundamentally, what we see after a horse has been removed from the vet's list and is ready to race again, the likelihood of fatal injury for those horses having come off the vet list remains quite high, about 40 to 50% higher than horses that have never been on the vet list for the first 6 months having come off the vet list. So there's a residual effect there. After that period of time, the risk appears to start to reduce a little bit. So between 6 months and 1 year following coming off the vet list, the risk is down to about 30%, I think it is, greater than if they'd never been on the vet list. But what's really interesting and a little bit surprising is that according to these data, the risk never returns back to baseline. It gets quite close, or gets quite close to being not statistically significant. At the moment, it is still statistically significant, and the risk is elevated at around 10% greater for those horses that have ever been on the vet list compared to any horse that's never been on the vet list for the rest of their career. And you can see the range of days post coming off the vet list. There's one horse clearly was up to 10 years still racing post coming off the vet list. That would have been a single individual animal. So you can see that it's really important to be aware of the impact of not coming off the vet list or the vet list itself, but the reasons horses go onto vet lists, and understand that actually it's really critical to see that understanding some of the veterinary and medical records and veterinary history of these horses will only, and doing that better, will only improve the predictive ability of our models. And that's where I want to take us now, over to Hong Kong, where I've had the pleasure of working with the Hong Kong Jockey Club for a number of years now, had a PhD student over there 15 years ago, and they currently fully fund a postdoc of mine to work on these analyses and produce this risk profiling tool that we return to the Hong Kong Jockey Club. So these are the individuals who are involved in that particular study. Tom Zuffer is the postdoc who is now, as I said, fully employed by, contracted by the Jockey Club to produce these, and further, produce these risk profiles on a routine basis, but also develop what you might grandiosely term new products for them to try and improve the welfare of the horses in Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong is a very, very different situation to most other racing jurisdictions. I understand that. You know, they have 1,300, 1,400 horses in training at Sha Tin, all stabled very, very close. All the veterinary provision is provided by Hong Kong Jockey Club vets. They have regulatory vets and they have clinical vets. All the clinical vet notes are automatically uploaded to a database, so available to us. Regulatory vets are independent of the clinical vets, and the regulatory vets are those who go and do the pre-race veterinary inspection. And they can, in some different ways, they can mandate that an individual horse should be examined at a particular time by the clinical vet as they wish. So those two separate arms of the veterinary team are genuinely separate, and they try and work as independently as possible. What we have is, so I want to give you a flavor of the system we have in place for Hong Kong now. So they've been developed and trialed back since 2022 when the Hong Kong Jockey Club part-funded Tom's PhD to work in this particular area. And they were launched, so we started trialing it back in December of 2024, taking the list of horses that were entered at that time into a race. They race twice a week in Hong Kong. So every race list, as the horses were declared, 120, 140 horses on a particular day, we would run them through the model, crank the algorithm, produce our predictions. But then for the first 6 months, which happened to be the last 6 months of that particular season, we kept that to ourselves. We then tested it. We tried to understand how well it was working, tweaked the model. And we're only really confident enough to then launch it in earnest at the beginning of the current racing season that's about to end in Hong Kong in September 2025. So that's when we started delivering this product to Hong Kong for the regulatory vets as they do their pre-race veterinary inspections. So what happens is that new data are extracted and the models are run twice a week. That happens, we get the declarations or entries list 3 days prior to each upcoming race day. They come to us. The time zones help a little bit here in terms of when work happens. Tom actually works from Italy, but they're run twice a week. Risk profiles are then shared with the veterinary team undertaking their pre-race veterinary inspections 2 days before the race. So data comes to us, we crank them through the model. That takes about 3 or 4 hours to run that algorithm for 140 horses. And then that risk profile for every horse goes back to the Jockey Club 1 day 2 days before the race, 1 day before the pre-race veterinary inspection. Pre-race veterinary inspections tend to occur early in the morning, as you might imagine. A trainer with a number of horses entered to race on the following day will have all the horses queued up, ready to go. The vets are under quite a lot of pressure to do these very quickly. They take about 30 seconds each. Quick trot up, feel down the back of the legs, tendons, quick check of the heart, and that's pretty much the pre-race veterinary inspection done. But what they also have available to them, and they can look at this before they go, they walk around with an iPad, and every time they plug in a new horse's number, this is kind of a schematic of what they now see as they approach that horse. They either look at this before they approach that individual animal, or they look at it afterwards if they're at all concerned. And I'll just talk you through this. So LA, the big LA, refers to post-race lameness. So these are the predictions from the model for post-race lameness. On the far side of the graph are the predictions, this is made-up data, are the predictions for the upcoming race. So these are genuinely the future predictions. So this is where the horse what the profile looks for that horse in the upcoming race. 2 rows, one is the predicted rank, so actually out of the 120 odd horses that we predict for, where does this individual horse rank on that particular day? So you're either 1 or 120 in terms of your risk, level of risk. So this is number, so the one on the shown here is 8 out of 127, so it's in the top 6%. But then also what we produce, recognizing that different race days have different levels of risk, different profiles, different types of horse, different levels of races going on. We produce the absolute risk for that individual animal on that day as well. So that the vets on the ground now are very used to understanding what level of risk horses are at. And actually, if they see something that's really off the chart, something up to 11 or 12% absolute risk, then they may pay greater attention to that individual animal than they might to something that's at 5 or 6%, which is still higher risk than the rest of the population, but it's maybe not as alarming as it might be for something that's much, much higher. And then if you look at the other columns we have here, we also provide, when available, because obviously horses have to have been through the system a number of times, they have to have 5 previous race meets, we provide the risk profiles that were provided for the 5 previous race meetings. And they're color-coded to some extent so that the vets don't necessarily need to look at the numbers, but they can understand the general trajectory of risk for that individual animal. So not only will they say, okay, what's its absolute or ranked risk on this one day, but actually what's its profile doing? Is it increasing in risk or is it relatively level? And it might be the case that you end up with some horses that are actually their trajectory doesn't change very much, but they're just a moderately higher risk horse that maybe sits in the 20 to 30% level of risk. And actually maybe those horses are less concerning. Some vets will regard horses that are actually on a higher plane of risk, so the trajectory increasing, those are the ones they really want to be concerned about, or indeed those horses that have had a sudden jump in risk for whatever reason that they are unaware of. They don't need to necessarily know why that has happened, but it's a trigger for them to say, okay, we need to spend maybe a little bit more time understanding something more about these individual animals. And really, when we talk to the vets doing the pre-race veterinary inspections, what they say is, this is great, we use it primarily if there are horses that we're unsure about. And actually, we really just don't know what to do about an individual animal. If they're slightly unsure, they know it's got a bit of a dodgy history. If they can then look at the data, what the data is telling them, and they say, okay, the data is also flagging this as a red, maybe they'll make one decision. And that decision may not be prevent it from racing, but it may be to mandate, for example, a post-race veterinary inspection as well. Not all horses get a post-race veterinary inspection, but it may be that actually they say, the clinician for this individual horse needs to go back to this horse post-race in the day or 2 after and just check on it and see what it looks like. So the models themselves, they account for horse, jockey, trainer, race, seasonal effect. They're very complex models. They include a whole load of variables. But the one thing I wanted to take from this is actually this, really, we've always tried to use this as proof of concept as to how important veterinary histories are when we're trying to improve the predictability of the models. And prior administration of an intra-articular corticosteroid injection or non-steroidals, treatments, histories of lameness, UP is unacceptable performance in this case, so that's the other outcome that we model for the Hong Kong Jockey Club. That's a somewhat subjective assessment of the performance of the horse as decided on by the stewards, stipendiary stewards. History of diagnostic imaging, bronchoscopy, interestingly, irregular or excessive racing and track work patterns are really all important in the predictive ability of these models. And what's important is actually we don't just look across the population. So what's different about this individual animal compared to the other 120 horses racing on that day? Actually, what's different about this individual horse compared to its own prior longitudinal history? What has changed for this individual horse that means all of a sudden it is entering a race at an elevated level of risk that means something should be done about that individual animal, whether, as I said, that could simply be greater veterinary attention. But fundamentally, the big takeaway is that for the post-race lameness model, inclusion of these variables improved the predictive ability by 60%. And when we saw that about 18 months ago, that's when we said it's back to the Hong Kong Jockey Club. I said, okay, I think we're in a position now where you can genuinely make use of this. And actually, I would have some confidence that what we would be telling you would be valid and would have some surety about it and actually would genuinely result in a reduction in risk. So just to talk a couple of slides about the results. So I talked about the risk factors that are included. As I said, we launched this in September 25 at the beginning of the season. We do a half-season audit, and we're a couple of days away from the end of their season, otherwise I would have presented the full-year audit. But we did a half-season audit back in February. 44 of the 88 race days, that should be, rather than races, at that period of time. That many, 4,700 starters. What I should say is we don't attempt to predict for all horses entering a race. If they've not had at least 2 starts in Hong Kong, we don't have enough available data on those horses to make what we see as a reasonably accurate or valid prediction. So we don't attempt to predict for all horses. They have to have been in Hong Kong and have to have raced at least twice before we make an attempt at prediction. 44 race meetings, 25 of them at one track and 19 at another. The reason for saying that is that actually we have identified that the performance of the different models does vary by those 2 different tracks. I'm not sure why. Over those 4,700 starters, there were 61 occurrences of unacceptable performance and 107 of post-race lameness. The OVE CVC is a definition of post-race lameness. It is not just the official veterinary examination, it's also additional information we're able to acquire post in the 2 or 3 days after the race itself, which we think is a better definition of post-race lameness. So just want to show you a few of these plots here now, just to orientate you. So this is at Sha Tin, one of the tracks, and this is trying to predict unacceptable performance. And this takes all of those horses that have raced at Sha Tin over the 6-month period. And along the x-axis is essentially the fifth percentile of risk. So all the horses on the right are those that we predicted are in the top 5 percentile of risk. So they're above 95% in terms of where they rank on risk. And all the other, and then essentially each bin has the same number of horses in it, about 100 horses in each of those 5 percentile bins. Those to the left we predicted would be very low risk, those to the right would be very high risk. And then we superimpose upon that, once the races are run, we superimpose where the individual animals with the individual predicted risks ended up. And what you can see in this case is that of all of the unacceptable performances, 42% of them were in the top 5% of risk. So if it had been a totally useless model, then we'd have expected something flat with these bars being evenly distributed throughout the plot. If a horse was in the top 5% of predicted risk, they were 13 times more likely to end up with a unacceptable performance than all of the other horses included in the model. And the unacceptable performance frequency in this prediction at Sha Tin was about 12.3%, or 123 per 1,000 starts if you were in the top 5% of risk, compared to 9 per 1,000 starts if you're in the bottom 95% of risk, so all other horses. Same plots, same at Happy Valley, similar level of performance, maybe not quite as good, 39% of all unacceptable performances in the top 5%. But you'll notice that unacceptable performance, for whatever reason, is slightly less common at Happy Valley than Sha Tin, so more difficult to predict. And that certainly plays out in the frequency of unacceptable performance we see in the top 5%, about 8.1%, or 81 per 1,000 starts. And then in the bottom 95%, about 7 per 1,000 starts. When we look at post-race lameness generally appears to be slightly more difficult to predict. We think that is partly because we're uncovering lots of different horses who then have subsequent records in the data that wouldn't be classified as a genuine post-race lameness, but something goes on in that race that results in them being post-race lame maybe 1 or 2 days later without any other fast work in between times. So we think this is partly due to a lack of precision with respect to the case definition. We are tightening up on this. But generally, they're slightly more difficult to predict. But in this case, at Sha Tin, post-race lameness, about 30% of those with post-race lameness were in the top 5% of risk. Again, you see the frequency numbers down below. And then the same at Happy Valley, Again, doesn't perform quite as well at Happy Valley, with only 19% of post-race lamenesses in the top 5%. But interestingly, at Happy Valley, we seem to capture the majority of the others that might have been in the top 5% in the 90th to 95th percentile of risk for predicting at Happy Valley. So what we talk to the vets in Hong Kong about is, if there's a race meet at Happy Valley, actually maybe they pay greater attention to the horses in the top 10%. We might give them a slightly extended list of horses at elevated risk, and they look at those that fall in the top 10% of ranking of risk. Compared to if they're at Sha Tin, they may actually be able to provide their resources more targeted on just the top 5%. So we're always looking at understanding under which circumstances the model predicts best, and for which type of horse and at which racetrack they predict best. You can see at Happy Valley there is a fair smattering of horses that appear throughout the whole plot in terms of our predictive ability there. So there's definitely more work for us to do to understand what is going on at Happy Valley that means we're less able to predict post-race lameness at that particular track. That's likely what will happen, is that we will mean probably developing a separate independent model purely for Happy Valley that only takes account of risk factors at Happy Valley. They do have slightly different surfaces. Sha Tin has a synthetic track and a turf track. Happy Valley only has turf. So there is a little bit of mixing of surface here. We also have produced these plots by surface, by race course as well, but for brevity, then I've just included by track at this point. So there's definitely more work to do. But fundamentally, I think what we've shown is that with the availability of accurate, complete veterinary and exercise data, it's enabled progression to robust risk profiling system that genuinely has proved useful to the vets in Hong Kong. It's now the case that they regard this as business as usual. So I think the point is that now it's embedded into their systems, it's going to stay in their systems, and we have just recently agreed to hand over the running of the algorithm to the team in Hong Kong, which frees Tom up to then develop the next, as I said, sort of product, which for us and for Hong Kong, what they really are after is not just focused on risk related to racing, but actually start to develop a model that provides a risk for all horses in Hong Kong, probably every other week in training. So that would mean taking the data every 2 weeks, maybe splitting it in half and doing half one week, half another week, and rerunning the model, developing a new model, rerunning that, going through the validation process, rerunning it, and then providing that information not back just to the vets, but also to the trainers, so that they can say, okay, on a Monday morning, they say, well, this is the risk profile of all my horses, which of them have gone up, which of them have gone down. Am I going to change? Is this going to influence my decision-making about what I do with those horses with respect to fast work, which races I decide to enter them into, and that sort of thing. So that's the next exciting piece in the jigsaw for us. We're just starting on that work. As I said, we only launch these when we're truly happy that they are of genuine value. So we will do so probably slowly. It'll probably be about 18 months before it's used in earnest in Hong Kong. No model, I think it's really important, I always say this all the time, will ever be perfect. There's always going to be unknown or novel risk factors. There's always going to be a bit of bad luck. And we really regard these, there's no way we would ever suggest these are a panacea, they're going to solve every problem, but we do regard them as a really valuable advisory tool. And using them in that way, we think is genuinely realistic. And the other, as I said, the other way that, not just regarding whether individual horses should enter races or not should be scratched from individual horses, the other way that the vets are now starting telling us they're using these are to decide which horses would most benefit from a post-race clinical exam or indeed from advanced imaging. They have plenty of advanced imaging in Hong Kong, but they can't get every horse through every bit of advanced imaging every week, for example. That's clearly unrealistic. They want to be able to say, okay, we're going to put those horses that are most likely to benefit from that advanced imaging through those different imaging modalities. So that's the other thing, the other aspect that they tend to use this information for, to say, okay, well, these are the higher risk horses. If we've got a list that we want to put through PET or CT or MRI, then these are the horses we should really be spending time with. And then finally, just in the last couple of minutes, I just want to talk about bring this back out to this part of the world and what this might mean for us. So we know that HICE has been collecting some veterinary data from the 2022, 23 and 24 foal crops. The important thing to remember here is that actually that's something like 18,000 with at least one start when I was provided these data by Jen, so that's probably a little bit out of date now. And clearly when we start this work, then that'll be updated again. And about 8,000 horses with at least one published workout with no race at that time. They may well have had a race start since, with all of their treatment records. And what's exciting is that that's already more data available here than is available in maybe 10 years of data from Hong Kong, given the size of the population. So I think what we've learned from Hong Kong can hopefully be rapidly implemented to data here over in North America. And the aim would be really specifically to examine the strength of those associations from our prior veterinary interventions and fatal injury in this particular part of the world. Given what we've learned, we've done a lot of different manipulation of data trying to understand what's important in terms of predicted risk. So we've got a bit of a big head start there to start using those data right from the get-go to see whether the same of what we find in Hong Kong really stands up over here that then actually might provide the next big initiative for racing in this country. So as I said, this is work that's going to start October of this year for 12 months. Very generously funded by Grace and Jockey Club Research Foundation and the Jockey Club, for us to have a master's student who is likely to be a computing science student who will be very, very able to work with these data, will work with the postdoc who's got all the experience, who does the Hong Kong stuff, and really just to see whether, firstly, to examine the consistency and the veracity of reporting, and then, as I said, confirm or identify new veterinary-related risk factors for fatal injury or indeed other injuries in that population. It's clear that it may well be the case that there are different veterinary procedures and different veterinary protocols over here that don't pertain to Hong Kong and vice versa. So we will start by looking at those we already know to exist and then think about others with colleagues over here and think about that. And then towards the end of that, examine the predictive potential of that risk profiling and see whether and that'll be done blind as we did in Hong Kong, so to see whether if we'd had this in place, how well would the model have predicted either post-race lameness or lameness coming out of the race or indeed fatal injury if there are sufficient numbers of those. And I genuinely think this is, we always had the aspiration that the work in Hong Kong would not only benefit Hong Kong, but would serve as a real sort of proof of principle, proof of concept that actually gaining that veterinary information is really, really critical and is really the next big step in being able to predict and identify horses at greatest risk. So thank you very much for your time, and it's clearly time for me to shut up because my slides have gone. Thank you very much.